Hey guys, thank you for watching the SlatRock channel. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell icon to get notified every time we post a new video. And if you've already done so, just make sure that it's still active. Today we present you with 16 strange details about the WWE locker room. Number 16. Phone calls aren't made inside. During his tenure with WWE, Enzo Amore got on the bad side of plenty of superstars for many reasons. One such reason was that the certified G would have loud phone calls in the locker room, forcing everyone to listen in. As if this wasn't bad enough, Amore would reportedly make fun of the wrestling business during these calls in front of more seasoned veterans like Seth Rollins and Finn Balor. This disrespect quickly led to Amore getting kicked out of the locker room for a while, though the former Cruiserweight champion has denied the claims, boasting to interviewers that he had his own private locker room, a fact that no one else in the WWE seems to agree with. Number 15. No cameras allowed in the locker room. With shows like WWE 24, Chronicle, and 365 being popular on the network, the WWE Universe have been able to get a good look into the world of WWE backstage. One place that is rarely seen, though, is the locker room itself, as backstage reactions such as Kevin Owens getting told that Vince McMahon didn't like his WrestleMania 33 match are usually featured in the elusive gorilla position. While the WWE 24 specials about NXT did show the developmental brand's locker room, cameras are forbidden from the WrestleMania locker room, as with so much focus being on the superstars in the ring, outside the ring, and now even backstage, it's nice for them to have one place that's truly private. Number 14. No filming social media content. A follow-up to the no cameras allowed rule, the WWE superstars are not allowed to film themselves or their colleagues inside of the locker room. It makes sense, as if WWE's official production teams aren't allowed to film, there's no chance for someone like Zack Ryder to film and get away with it. As the locker room is shared by so many superstars, everyone is expected to respect those around them. And while some superstars have filmed themselves in the past, this is almost always in an empty locker room before the show starts. A haven from the hustle and bustle of the job, no superstar wants to be interrupted by a performer cutting a promo when they just want to relax. Number 13. New locker room leaders have emerged. The role of being a locker room leader is something that happens gradually and naturally. Over time, superstars have grown into the role, such as The Undertaker and John Cena, while others like CM Punk have tried to claim the spot only to be rejected by the talent. With the Deadman and Cena now firm part-timers, new leaders have emerged, with Daniel Bryan being one of the most respected stars in the SmackDown locker room. On Raw, Roman Reigns has emerged as a locker room leader after being thrust into the main event, though after stepping away from the company to battle leukemia, fellow Shield brother Seth Rollins has taken the place of the big dog. Number 12. Friends and family usually aren't allowed. We've said how the WWE locker room is a private place for the superstars, where everyone is not allowed, and yes, that does include their family and friends. While loved ones are allowed backstage, the locker room is off limits, as it may distract other superstars who are trying to relax. This makes sense in a way, as you wouldn't allow your family to come behind the scenes of your workplace if it meant disrupting and disrespecting your colleagues. With so much open space backstage, there's plenty of places for superstars to spend precious moments with their families and friends before or after a match, so being blacklisted from the locker room is not that big of a deal. Number 11. Brock Lesnar is on his own. It shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, but there are very special provisions in place for Brock Lesnar. The longest reigning Universal Champion, Lesnar reportedly barely interacts with talent backstage, something that has caused many superstars to resent him. The Beast Incarnate has been allowed his own private locker room, meaning he can react with whoever he wants and avoid everyone else. Part-time wrestlers often carry a negative stigma, though unlike part-timers such as Goldberg, The Undertaker, and others, it seems the Beast has made no effort at all to socialize with his colleagues, with the fact that this rudeness is coming from the Universal Champion doing no good for locker room morale. Number 10. Management pays attention to locker room opinions. The relationship between WWE superstars can often live or die by their interactions in the locker rooms, with several reports getting out to the public. A bad vibe in the locker room could even lead to a superstar getting punished by the company, with Braun Strowman reportedly having his push slowed down due to backstage heat. By contrast, Roman Reigns reportedly always showed respect to his fellow superstar backstage, which is just one reason why WWE hoped to push him as their top guy before his hiatus. While a locker room reputation isn't the most vital thing to make a superstar, it can certainly make or break a wrestler. Number 9. A video feed of the ring is always shown. When a superstar makes it to the main roster, some fans could think that their training days are over. After all, surely leaving NXT for either Raw or SmackDown is akin to graduating from college or university into the world of work. The truth is that WWE want their superstars to constantly be improving and pay attention to the shows and their fellow superstars. To do this, the locker room will always have a video feed of the ring shown all day, allowing everyone to watch the show and study how the crowd are reacting. This feed actually starts long before the arena fills up with fans, meaning that any particularly dedicated superstars can watch the entire process of putting the ring together before they go out there. Number 8. Wrestlers get heat for leaving early. The WWE locker room is a place built on respect, and one key unwritten rule is that everybody should wait until the end of the show. Regardless of whether you're in the opening match or the main event, staying until the end shows courtesy to your fellow superstars who, like you, risk their bodies for entertainment. Some wrestlers have paid the price for not following this rule, with Braun Strowman allegedly leaving early during multiple shows, which gave the monster among men plenty of heat backstage. Chris Jericho has said on his podcast that he's given plenty of young stars a tongue lashing for leaving early, though there are reports that Lesnar is one who gets to leave early and get away with it. Number 7. Small parties are sometimes held. Traveling all across the world for months on end, the WWE locker room needs some fun backstage. The fun sometimes comes in the form of parties, especially if someone is celebrating a birthday or special event. When Kane received a cake backstage during a live event, the WWE decided to turn it into an in-ring segment, and the Big Red Machine isn't the only one to be on the receiving end of a delicious attack. Seth Rollins tried to hit Xavier Woods with cake during an episode of Up Up Down Down, and while these parties are not usually held at important events such as pay-per-views, they can certainly lighten the mood at live events. Number 6. John Cena watches every match. If there was an opposite to Brock Lesnar's attitude backstage, it's fellow part-timer and WWE champion John Cena. While Cena has left his full-time schedule behind to expand his acting career, Cena insists on watching every match from start to finish when he's at Raw or SmackDown Live. Speaking on Talk is Jericho, Kevin Owens said how Cena loves to see how the crowd reacts and see which superstars are stepping up. The former NXT and Universal Champion also admitted that he and some other superstars have sat by Cena's side during matches, hoping to get some pearls of wisdom from one of the most iconic champions in all of WWE history. Number 5. Don't disrespect the doctors. With pro wrestling being such a risky profession, the WWE employ the best doctors for the superstars to trust. Working with superstars, it is the doctors' roles to make sure injuries and illnesses are treated immediately, a job they should be able to do without being disrespected by those they're helping. After allegedly slandering some of the WWE doctors in front of the locker room, Baron Corbin reportedly lost his Money in the Bank title shot as punishment for his actions. The entire relationship between the doctors and superstars are based on trust, and disrespecting them violates that trust. And while many have been fired over this, Corbin's punishment was still very severe. Number 4. No more hazing. In many sports, there is the tradition of hazing, where veterans would take it upon themselves to welcome new talent by forcing the rookies through annoying, humiliating, or painful acts. In WWE, John Bradshaw Layfield is known for harassing countless wrestlers throughout the years, with many leaving the business solely because of the Texan. With WWE becoming a more public brand, however, there is now a strict no hazing policy backstage, though silly pranks and ribs between superstars are still around. But when these pranks become cruel or intentionally malicious, The company has no choice but to step in, with punishments for hazing ranging from strong fines to firings. Number 3. Watch where you eat. As highly trained athletes, it's pretty obvious that WWE superstars are very particular on what foods they put in their bodies. While some superstars have even gone to provide their own meals, the WWE still offers catering, though superstars have gotten in trouble for eating in the locker room. The most famous story of eating involves a rookie Miz, who not long after joining the company was kicked out of the locker room for getting crumbs on someone's bag. Forced to change in toilets and closets for months, The Miz would eventually earn his way back into the locker room, and now, as a leader, hopefully prevents new superstars from making the same mistakes he did. Number 2. Bosses and writers never enter. As we've learned, the WWE locker room is a sacred place just for superstars. Phone calls aren't allowed, and neither are family and friends. As a place where superstars can relax and prepare before shows, the locker room is reportedly off-limits to the bosses and writers, as the superstars shouldn't be disturbed. If someone does need to share information, they will meet a superstar outside and pass on the info there, rather than break the safe haven that is the locker room, where WWE superstars can have a few moments of peace in their otherwise very hectic profession. Number 1. No more wrestlers' court. One of the oldest traditions of the WWE locker room, the wrestlers' court was managed by wrestlers to solve problems backstage. Much like a real court, a judge would preside, often The Undertaker, as superstars alleged to have done wrong would be defended from the prosecution, usually JBL. While these proceedings would usually end with the accused apologizing and buying beer, stories quickly got out about how affected superstars were, with former women's champion Melina reportedly left in tears after one encounter. With some proceedings being nothing more than accepted bullying, wrestlers' court is thankfully a thing of the past, and we expect the WWE are hoping it stays buried, never to be brought back. Well guys, that's our list. Do you know any other strange details about the WWE locker room that we didn't list here? Let us know in the comments below. If you like this video, don't forget to check out our previous video, the top 10 WWE cast-offs who are still wrestling. And also check out our other high-rated videos by clicking at the upper right-hand corner or down in the description field. Hit that subscribe button and the bell icon so you don't miss a single new video. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and as always, thanks for watching.